Syria. So what happens now? After more than a decade of civil war and multiple decades dominated by a particular dynasty, the regime of Bashar Al-Assad has fallen. In just 12 days of rapid fighting, Syria is now left in a power vacuum, raising more questions such as who controls Syria? What are the relations of the internal factions? And which strategic players, namely Russia, Iran, Turkey, Israel, or even the US, come out as winners or losers? What does this mean for the region as a whole? All this and more covered in this video.
This is The Global Gambit.
How are you going, guys? So thanks for being here, and if you're new, then do consider subscribing, as I've been doing my best to cover these developments and events as quickly as possible, but as accurately and as fairly as possible. We're also approaching 40,000 subscribers, so I'd love to have you as part of that. But still, Assad's regime that has lasted over 50 years under his family's control ended in days. For as many years it took for him to be in power, so many hours it's taken for it to end. Rebel forces led by Hay'at Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, a group it is important to note was once affiliated with al-Qaeda, has stormed the capital of Damascus, seized control after a series of those rapid coordinated assaults coming from the south and the north, with many other factions, which began in very end of November. It reminds me very much indeed the rapidity of this assault to the Taliban takeover of Kabul in 2021, and equally in what could happen in the post-war transition. But if you want to hear more of that, then either you can find my personal takes at the end of this video. I encourage you to stick around to hear how this could play out for the strategic players, who wins, who loses, and so on. Now, the victory does mark an astonishing turn of events in the war that seemed far from over even just a few weeks ago. Post-war planning for Syria is now at the top of the agenda, and the factions can manage to share that power would ultimately ensure the best possible outcome, or unfortunately infighting will tear the country further apart. Equally, I think it's important to compare this maybe initially to Libya as well, because Libya is a country not too far away and can offer important lessons about what happens in Syria. Making comparisons between the countries is delicate, and we shouldn't treat them completely the same. But nevertheless, the recent events in Syria bring to mind what happened in Libya at the end of 2011 and the fall of the Gaddafi regime, and what happened subsequently in a civil war with the US-backed support of a transitional government trying to establish elections and ensure a quote-unquote democratic pathway forward, versus General Haftar, which was supported by Russia and others in trying to keep the country under more of a conventional setting that it had been for many years. The second lesson from Libya can also be about the role of foreign powers, namely in how it deals with them, how Syria deals with those regional or global powers. Libyans allowed foreign powers to arguably divide them and split them in order for them to benefit. And so a lot of the political and economic developments were prevented from occurring. New Syrian leadership would need to find arguably a common denominator among themselves, and instead of rushing to hold elections, maybe have more of a grand government of unity and ensure a peaceful transition towards potentially elections. Again, some of my more personal thoughts about what a post-war scenario could look like at the end of the video. Still, let's move to some of the main winners and losers here. Now, Russia is a complicated one in that it is certainly a setback for the Russians, but depending upon how they play their cards, they could mitigate those losses. Russia has certainly lost its great power projection in that it was the country that ultimately came out in ensuring that Assad was kept in power during the more heightened part of the civil war in the 2010s, but they have lost a significant foothold in the Mediterranean and that sort of near abroad area, and they have put a heck of a load of investment into Assad as a leader. Moscow has supported them for years with military aid and airstrikes, aiming to ensure that its key strategic assets, namely the military or naval and air bases in the western part of Syria, are sustained. But with Assad's regime collapsing, Russia now faces a critical juncture. The collapse of the Assad regime is a contradiction of Russia's ability to project that power, as I said, and thus its claim of being, you could argue, a great power. Now, inevitably, many people will disagree with that and state that Russia is still a very competent power. But the fact that Russia did not come to the aid of such an important country that has always voted very loyally and reliably with it on UN resolutions, for example, shows you that Russia arguably didn't have the bandwidth to come to the aid of Syria. It also damages their ability to really maneuver and access parts in Africa and the Mediterranean if the factions decide that they no longer wish Russia to sustain those areas and control them. Indeed, Russia has been bombing these groups in the past, so it might not come as too much of a surprise that they don't really want Moscow hanging around. One potential possibility over those assets, the naval base and air base, is that Russian support for, say, an al-Wait statelet along the Mediterranean coast, where its two bases are, could be favoured. The al-Wait minority was a backbone of the Assad regime, and so could still play a role in ensuring Moscow's interests are heard. Moscow could even cite US support, arguably, for a Syrian Kurdish statelet in the northeast as setting a precedent for Russia doing something similar to the Alawites. So you could see Russia trying to play the diplomatic card here instead of using hard power and military force. I find it difficult to believe that Russia will completely turn its back on Syria, but it just doesn't have necessarily the capability and capacity nor attention to really focus on this at the moment. Its strategic priorities and emphasis is Ukraine without question. Moscow's next steps will be crucial, either whether it decides to back those new factions or find some way to at least maintain influence in the region. It cannot afford to do that. Next up is Iran, who, of all the actors potentially affected by this, is arguably the all in all out loser. They are one of Assad's other main backers, and it finds itself in a precarious position similar to Moscow. Tehran's strategic objectives in Syria have always been clear, that they leverage them, much like they do Hezbollah and their other proxies, to extend their influence across the Middle East, and in this case, the Levant. The fall of Assad is another nail in the coffin of Iran's axis of a resistance, which will prompt Iran to really need to reconsider its security strategy. In a matter of weeks, Iran has lost so many pillars. Hezbollah has been all but wiped out. Hamas is significantly cut back. And all of this at the hands of its arch nemesis, Israel, who in and of itself has engaged with it as well. I think it's difficult to overstate the importance of the Assad regime to Iran. Without him, Iran's ability to really rebuild Hezbollah's power has weakened significantly, as has its ability to really counterbalance against Israel. Moreover, because Assad was a leader of a nation state, not just merely a proxy and militia entity. It is a nation state, and so you lose that optics aspect in international relations. Syria enabled the same territorial continuity, for example, from Iran to Lebanon that was known as the Shia Crescent, and gave Iran this unprecedented strategic depth while keeping the wars far away from its borders. It indicates Iran's inability to influence what happens in the Middle East without these proxies. Moreover, 2024 was a huge setback for Iran, as they've lost their ability to leverage plausible deniability. The idea that in the past they could deny any role in attack or strike or event across the rest of the region because of the proxy system. However, with the loss of these proxies, coupled with the fact that they finally engaged with Israel directly, shows that Iran has lost this. It's also arguably been exposed as being quite vulnerable because its efforts to deter Israel and others from directly striking it or engaging with it have been revealed to be quite weak. So Iran looks in a very precarious position. The challenge for Iran now will be to manage its relationships with rival factions while keeping an eye on its own long-term interests. The risk of an unstable Syria, such as being led by HTS, gaining ground, could be disastrous for Iran's remaining proxies within the area. And you could maybe see Iran beginning to consolidate most of its focus in Iraq, which is yet to receive any of its own volatility. Next, let's talk about Turkey, one of the most powerful players in the region, in northern Syria particularly, and arguably one of the bigger winners of this whole thing. Probably, in my opinion, the biggest winner, although it still has a few concerns around the Kurds. Turkey has long opposed Kurdish forces in the northeastern part of Syria, for example, which it views them as the extension of the PKK, this Kurdish separatist group. With the Kurd-led forces now controlling large swathes of northeastern Syria, unquestionably, Turkey has taken military action to counter those. Most Arab states, for example, will view the events in Syria as a net plus for Turkey, and therefore they need to manage their own interests vis-a-vis an emboldened Turkey that maybe wants to get more directly involved in Syria to protect its interests. The relations Turkey has with Israel will also be very relevant here, as both will have to deal with one another, considering they directly border Syria. But considering the comments Erdogan has made about Netanyahu and Israel over its war in Lebanon and Gaza, means that this is going to be incredibly difficult to do. Turkey faces a delicate balancing act. On the one hand, it's backing its certain rebel groups against the Assad forces, which will obviously it will seek to have as part of any negotiations in power. But equally, it's trying to manage its relationship HTS, the group that Ankara does label as a certain organization, we'll put it that way. The question is, will Turkey capitalize on the Assad fall? And if so, to what extent? And how will it use diplomacy to try to avoid destabilization in its near abroad, at least, and cooperate with countries that it doesn't exactly have great existing relations with? Then there's Israel, which has long had its eyes on Syria, mainly due to the role of Hezbollah, which has been a major, or was a major force in upholding Assad's interests and presence. But with him gone, Israel now faces a lot of challenges. For years, Israel's strategy has been to push back against the Iranian broader influence, launching strikes on Iranian targets and Hezbollah installations, for example. But now, with HTS and the other rebel factions having that power, Israel must decide how to engage. As I said, the complexities over Turkey will be but one aspect. Whether they choose to do something over the Golan Heights equally is important to keep in mind because of the view of that by much of the international community. Could the Israelis seek to install more of a buffer zone against the Syrian border to protect themselves, which would obviously fall under illegal occupation, given that's how it's viewed by most other countries? So while Israel may be pleased that Assad is gone, it's wary of the rise of these Islamist factions, Syria, especially those tied with al-Qaeda. So Israel, could it work in more of an intelligence capacity to undermine those groups from ever threatening Israeli interests? Then there is the United States, which, whilst the US is not perhaps the main potential actor in this regard, it has always maintained a footprint, namely the military entities in the northeastern part of Syria that have been combating ISIS. The US has maintained that military presence, but with the Assad regime crumbling, the US faces that tough decisions, particularly as a Trump administration comes in, making it even more complicated. Will he just decide to even more accelerate the withdrawal of those forces? Do they continue to support the Kurdish forces in the northeast, or do they shift to preventing Islamist groups like HTS from gaining more power? The US has to balance the fight against ISIS with the need to contain Iran and prevent further instability, or at least protection of Israel, given that's what Trump would be considering approaching to do as well. The US approach to Syria, for example, has been largely dictated by tolerating Assad and the patrons that were aligned to Iran, but hyper-focusing on Islamic State, providing humanitarian assistance, but ceasing military and political aid, if that because of the relationship and reliance on Turkey as a NATO member. If the US continues to back Kurdish forces, it therefore would risk angering Turkey, which is a disproportionately important NATO ally, particularly in the case of Ukraine, and also with what the European Union relies on Turkey for in terms of migration flows. So its small but strategic military footprint will require the US to navigate this new phase of Syria's transition, the transition in which Syria presents an opportunity potentially for the US to regain influence in Damascus and encourage any emerging Syrian leadership to contribute to regional stability, coexistence, and peace. The incoming Trump administration could prioritize assisting the transitional government in holding elections if he believes that he can get something back. As I've said many times on the channel, Trump is primarily driven by what he can get in return, transactionality, and I don't think that will be any different here. Trump could also seize the opportunity to facilitate dialogue between any new Syrian leadership and Israel, for example. I think it's quite clear that Trump wants to build on the Abraham Accords of his first administration, possibly by officializing relations with Saudi Arabia. But equally, if he could get the recognition of Israel by Syria, that would be a huge win for the Trump administration and help to reintegrate Syria into the rules-based international order, or what we perceive as that. And so this leads me to my personal opinions about the situation. It's incredibly difficult to have a clear idea about this because Syria represents, to me at least, the single most complex conflict of modern day. The sheer amount of actors that were involved internally in the past 13 years of civil war, but also externally. Sometimes the US and Russia working together against ISIS, but then against one another because one wants Bashar Al-Assad in power and the other wants him gone. It's crucial also to remember the size of the Kurdish population in the northeast, and that the fact that they seek some form of country. This naturally brings in the role of Turkey, again by extension, who doesn't want an empowered Kurdish movement, let alone any actual official Kurdistan. But could we see an attempt of self-determination in the northeast and the carving up of Syria if there is no ability for a consensus amongst all the parties that have led to the toppling of Assad. If HTS, the SNA, and the Kurdish forces and others cannot agree on some general basic themes and principles, then you may well see the Kurds believing that this is the best opportunity they can to consolidate the territory and declare independence, which could lead to conflict and the whole thing in Syria breaking out into something worse. An alternative could be a sort of federalization of Syria in the sense that leadership is decentralized. So whilst the Kurds don't get an entirely new independent nation state, they have a greater autonomy within the northeast of Syria, but it's still within the nation state of Syria. However, that rests heavily on all the factions, again, having genuine intentions, which, given the sheer number of them and competing interests and priorities, therefore, is it's not impossible, but it seems unlikely at the moment. Most realistically, most of all the parties, particularly those externally affected, want stability, and for their interests, be them in immediate physical sense or longer term, be them economic and etc., not to be affected. If that is achievable to an extent, then maybe we will see Syria reincorporated into the international system much quicker than we have Afghanistan. Afghanistan's post-war transition has been one marred by reluctance among the US and others. $3 billion worth of aid is still held up in a Swiss bank because the United States doesn't want to be seen as legitimizing the Taliban. But equally, many countries do tacitly engage with Afghanistan because they know the Taliban is a more favorable option to, say, Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State of Kurzin, which is the regional variant of Islamic State. So I think in this regard, Syria is more likely to be brought back in if it is believed the new leadership is trustworthy and predictable. Ultimately, most countries will not care who's governing Syria as long as it's not breaking down into a complete and utter anarchy state or a failed state like that of Libya or Afghanistan. But while the fall of Assad may seem like a victory, it's just the beginning of a much bigger test. Can Syria avoid the fate of other nations in the region, and which countries of those will ultimately benefit? Assad's fall is a monumental shift for the Middle East, but comes after a year where the Middle East has been experiencing unprecedented and unrelenting amount of changes at rapid pace in a year that we've had more political elections and changes than ever. The region's biggest powers are all vying for that influence, and they, let alone the internal factions, will shape Syria's future. But what do you think will happen? Can Syria avoid that further chaos, or is this the beginning of something even worse? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, if you appreciate my effort to bring balanced or at least wide-ranging perspectives of these rapidly unfolding events, then don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell as we cover these events in even more detail in the future. But as we say on the Global Gambit, you either got to get playing or be played. Take care, everyone.